Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Thank you for finding us. Thank you for listening. If this is your first time with us on the podcast, press subscribe, press follow. Make sure you get all of our episodes every single week. I'm just going to start with some informal chat, if that's okay. Geoff, are you okay?
I am okay. A little bit groggy.
Where were you yesterday and why?
I was under general anaesthetic for a long-term procedure that's been in the offing for some time. I don't want to go into too much detail in case people are quite queasy, but yes, I had a cyst on my rear end that needed addressed, and
wasn't expecting that detail.
Yeah,
edit,
and yeah, I had to go under for a wee while to get it seen to. Which, yeah, I mean, I have to say it's the best and the worst of the NHS, because it took a long time to get it. I'm not complaining, incidentally, it wasn't serious. But when I did, the staff and clinicians at Stracathra Hospital were fantastic. But a special shout out to my fiancée Cash, who had to replace the dressing last night on said area. I mean, it's like the Amazon rainforest down there, I tell you.
Right, Jet, enough. That's that. This is a family podcast. Well done to the NHS is the message I think we're trying to
And well done to Cash, really, I think.
Right. Are you still? I think you're still high. You're gonna.
Yeah, I was. It's good stuff though. Like, sorry, I'm not in favour of it. Obviously, clearly, that's just for clinical reasons.
For clinical reasons only. So I'm not sure what the message there politically. I think is well done to the NHS staff. They probably need a bit more support to make it a bit more functional.
It's a good summary.
It's the kind of Holyrood Sources messaging that we're landing from that.
You don't get this unrested politics, do you?
You certainly do not. Mind you, they just get everything wrong, don't they? Right, on the podcast today...
That's our collaboration out the window then? Okay.
Oh, yeah, well, you know what? It's been months in the offing and it's just not coming together, so sack it. Right, we're going to talk about the SNP Conference today. It's been and gone, so analysis of the conference and John Swinney's speech to come. Plus, we've got lots of your questions on various topics, actually, that some of which we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks, some of which you're putting to us brand new. So we'll get to those as well. Right, just getting into SNP Conference. Peter got in touch on the podcast WhatsApp. The number, by the way, is 0333 404 6507. Peter said, I stood next to Andy while he got his pass for the SNP Conference that he definitely should have organised in advance, but decided then was not the time to be introducing myself. So first of all, Maciver, were you a shambles?
I have to say, no. I have to be honest, the SNP was a bit of a shambles when it came to passes for this conference, as many listeners, including some elected member listeners, will attest to. There was quite a significant amount of pass trouble from people who had dutifully and timeously ordered passes, which did not appear in the post. So,
well, you seem to have had a nice time at conference, Andy, because I literally this morning, so we're recording on Wednesday morning, I was scrolling on Twitter, as one does, and I came across, just popping up on my feed, was a post from Harry, who had posted several pictures from the SNP conference, and your face is among them. Did Harry come and ask you for a selfie?
Yes. Yes, Harry did. There were a couple of selfie requests, it must be said, at the weekend, which sadly are not because people wanted to have their pictures taken with Andy Maciver, but because they wanted to have their pictures taken with Andy Maciver of Holyrood Sources. The podcast was the star, not me, unfortunately, sad as I am to say it. But yeah, nice. There was love for the podcast at conference.
That's very kind,
folks. I have to say,
I have to echo that. We had drinks on a Saturday night. I was quite overwhelmed with some of the folk coming up and speaking to me and about it, and I was like, you do know that I just speak shite all the time, don't you? Like, really, it's the other two that put in the effort, and most of them were like, yeah, no, we get that.
Yeah, you're fooling no one here.
Yeah, anyway,
that's the first time
I wasn't actually at the conference, I have to say, but I did do that drinks reception on the Saturday night, which Andy Maciver came along and enjoyed himself.
I bet he did. Well, that's very nice that you're enjoying the... Thank you. Always come and say hello if you see us. It's always very nice. It's worth saying, Harry also posted pictures with Colin Mackay of STV, Kezia Dugdale, Stephen Flynn, and there's one here with Nicola Sturgeon, who is clutching her book and a Sharpie, as though she is ready to sign it, perhaps for Harry or perhaps for somebody else. I'm not sure. Nicola Sturgeon back at conference, Geoff. I mean, this will be her last one. She's standing down next year at the election.
Well, last one as an elected member. She may well
fair.
turn up.
Yeah, good point.
Turn up again. Yeah, I think she was in to flog her book, wasn't she? And my understanding, I read a story that she wasn't even offering the Amazon discount and was charging her fellow nationalists and loyal servants the full price, which I thought was quite something. But maybe that was just a complete work of fiction.
Right, onwards to some of the headlines from the SNP conference. Delegates overwhelmingly backing the leadership strategy that a new referendum should be triggered via an SNP majority of at least 65 seats in the Scottish Parliament after the election in 2026. Of course, John Swinney published this vision document called A Fresh Start with Independence, which went into, well, some more detail on things like economic migration and structural proposals for how an independent Scotland would operate. Let's start with Andy. Andy, I think the fact that this was backed by the conference clearly is, to state the obvious, a vote of confidence in John Swinney's proposal, but I'm just slightly intrigued as to the mechanics of the proposal and whether it's actually a sensible one.
Well, I think it makes, I suppose making sense and sensible are the same thing. Let's explore. I think it makes sense because that is the precedent. It's not a legal precedent, obviously. It's a political precedent rather than a legal precedent, which I think is an important distinction. But that is the precedent. Alex Salmond won a majority in 2011. He went to Westminster and said, "Can we please have a referendum?" Westminster said, "Yeah, that sounds fair enough. On you go." So, from that
Wasn't
point
that
of view,
simple, by the way? Can I just say?
I think it was. I mean, they didn't even have anybody have, I mean,
sophisticated political strategies deployed.
To be fair, they didn't have much in the way of good advice at that point behind the scenes at the SNP. So it was
bloody work, though, didn't it?
But yeah, look, that is, there is precedent now for that, and that's, so I think from that point of view it makes sense. I also think there is in my view a democratic legitimacy in that. As I've said before, I actually think there should have been a referendum after 2021. I think it was very clear that that was the mandate on which both the SNP and the Greens were elected, and between them they got a majority. This would obviously be clearer in that and there was a little bit of wobbling on this, incidentally, over the last couple of weeks. But that's been clarified at conference that they are not talking about an SNP plus Green majority. It's clearly, very clearly, an SNP only majority. And I think that, you know, frankly, I happen to agree with John Swinney that really, if the SNP win a majority on this very clear mandate that nobody can argue with, and they are denied a referendum, then you have to start to ask questions about the voluntary nature of the union. So, I mean, I think he's right about that. That's a different question, by the way, as to what will actually happen. I, as I said before, I don't think this really is a strategy necessarily for this year, next year's election. I think this strategy very clearly has Nigel Farage and 2031 in mind, but that's a slightly different point.
Because it is a high bar, Geoff. That's the thing. And the polls kind of currently suggest that the SNP would be in government but would not have a majority.
Yeah, the on his merits, you can see what John's trying to do. Obviously, he's trying to reach out to as many disaffected independent supporters as possible and say, look, if you want to have any shot at a referendum, any at all, you're going to have to vote the SNP. He's trying to shore up as many votes as possible. That's it in simplest terms. I do agree with Andy, though, about if this is achieved, and it is unlikely, it's not the favourite. I've said before that because of Reform surgence in the polls, it suggests that the SNP can win less percentage of the vote, fewer percentage of the vote, whatever you want to say, and still get a majority. So it can happen. But if it does happen, what is a voluntary union? And if they don't allow it, whoever's the incumbent Prime Minister at that point, then what is the route to Scotland to exercise its democratic right to self-government? And I think that question has to be posed. I kind of thought that John got a little bit and there was a motion on independence that he spoke on at the end, as you were referring to, and he said something along the lines of, "You don't know the tactics I'm going to deploy if we."
He said nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Yeah, nobody knows. And then I actually thought something that I saw Kat Headley, a regular on our podcast. She posted the secret plan to tackle inflation from West Wing and Josh Leiber. It's exactly where my mind went to as well, actually. I was like, oh, no, John. I think John's got to be careful around that stuff. Yeah. Genuinely, I do. And listen, not revealing your negotiating position and your tactics before you need to is always good politics, but suggesting that you have them does raise questions. Far better to say, look, if we win it, to people in the Labour Party and elsewhere, say, well, what is the democratic route to independence if you're going to say no? What is the democratic route? That's the best thing. So let's just say we get a majority, Mr. Sturmer. What are you going to do? Are you going to ignore the democratic will of the people of Scotland? That's much better tactics, I think, just now than talking about secret plans.
Secret plans.
Not saying he said secret plans, but that's where my mind went to.
Yeah. Well, I get you. I totally get you. Andy, did you want to come in?
Well, I just think, it might just be where... here's what I actually think is probably in John's head. So, if you look at polling, right, there's no question the SNP are going up in polling, but it's relatively slow. They still need a massive uplift to get to the point where they can actually secure a majority. They're still a pretty long way away from that, to be honest with you. And I think he will have his eyes wide open about the fact that there's a very, very good chance he's not going to get a majority in May, which then begs the question of, well, why are you doing this? And I think the answer to that question is that, look at where things are at Westminster. There's a pretty reasonable chance that in the term of the next Parliament, so John Swinney will almost certainly be First Minister again after May. It's, at this point, if you look at the polls, it's pretty inconceivable that won't be the case, with a very strong result under the circumstances. And during that 5 years, between 2026 and 2031, there is, at least at this point, a reasonable chance that Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister at Westminster, that Westminster will go on fire, basically, and that a large group of people in Scotland who voted no last time will look at the situation and say, actually, the Scottish Government's looking reasonably sensible under this guy. Maybe things have improved a little bit in some of the key areas. If they do, that is a huge part of this, incidentally, is that they need to start doing better. But I think John's thinking, look, this is the time when we can persuade the persuadables. It's got to be now. This next term has got to be when the persuadables get persuaded. So that you get to that point where the polling does say, 55, 60% of people consistently say they want an independent Scotland. That's where they need to get to. I really think this has got maybe half an eye on this May, but I think it's got half an eye on 2031.
Yeah, I think that's a fair piece of analysis, Andy, but I suppose my questions running through my head is, what happens if polling is to be believed and the SNP do win in the election, form a government, but not with a majority, but by his own threshold set, he can't take forward independence as a government priority because you haven't met that threshold. Yeah. So then how do you use those 5 years, as you've just outlined, to make the case, remake the case, restate the case? Do you have to do it through your party lens? And how credible is John doing that? Does he think, well, I set this threshold, nobody else, maybe I need to stand aside at some point and let fresh blood come in to make the case? I think it's difficult, but even then you've been elected on a mandate that said a majority and nothing else will lead to this. So I just think
surely there's
that's the
isn't
risk.
There merit though? Isn't there merit with those kind of centrist, soft unionists? I think I was thinking this a lot of the weekend. The SNP have got to remember. I know it's party conference, so you always appeal to the base at party conference, but the people the SNP actually need are soft centrist unionists. They need folk who voted no last time who will vote yes this time, right? That's pretty obvious, I think. I think that there's merit, presumably there must be some merit in him not getting a majority in May and then standing up and saying, all right, fair enough. I said that's what we needed to pursue independence. We didn't get that. my job for the next 5 years is to run Scotland. I'm the First Minister. And
surely
that then
the
becomes
dream outcome.
Well, I think it might be. That doesn't, Geoff, that then become a kind of 2007 to 2011 situation where people stand up and say, actually, they've done not a bad job here. They've just focused on the day job and they've actually made things a little bit better. So there must be some merit in that.
That's a very simple characterization of what happened between 2007 and 11, though, because we were still very much wanting the need for independence, and presumably John would do that himself. I just think we're not fully appreciating how difficult it is for an SNP First Minister to be in position and not advancing the case for independence in that time. And by the way, I'm not disagreeing. That 2007-11 experience was us earning our spurs and saying to the people we could do that. And incidentally, the conference speech that John delivered on Monday was very similar to that of Alex Salmond in 2013. Extolling the virtues of devolution, that we've done well in certain areas, and saying, but couldn't we do better with independence? The problem with that is, of course, when we did it in 2013, we had a government that was viewed as very competent. Right now, if we have to believe the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey just published last week, it suggests that the Scottish Government isn't held in as high regard as it once was. But, as I've said also previously, a number of podcasts, there is suggestions, and he mentions Alexander Dennis, and he makes the direct comparison with the lack of action at Grangemouth next to his action at Alexander Dennis, and he points to some successes. You can see that's the narrative they're trying to prove. And again, I'm going to repeat it because this is all you're going to hear from now until election day, is that I'm standing up for Scotland. I don't have to look down to Westminster to stand up for Scotland like you do, Anna Sauer. And Anna Sauer is going to come back and say, you're knackered, you're tired. That seems to be his theme, saying that it's time for fresh blood, because he can't talk about or extol the virtues of the Labour government and it's their first 14 months of office. Just one word of caution to all this, if I may. I don't know where we're going with this conversation, as I never do, because I never read anything. But there's a word of caution for the SNP, right? And I was looking at the polling in the run-up to Purda in March 2011. That's when Parliament breaks up for the election campaign. Labour were winning in 15 out of 16 polls in the lead up to 27 March. At one point in that cycle, they had a plus 13 over Labour, and at one point a plus 15. 5 weeks later, following 27 March, the SNP won by 13%. So I think we've got to be very careful about assuming what the trajectory is just now, and employing that to March next year. Campaigns can change things, and if anything tells you that, it was the 2011 experience.
What happened in that? Can anyone remember what happened in that 5 weeks?
There's a theory. I take the theory, Calum, that we just had a 2010 election in which Labour had returned. I think it was the status quo election, wasn't it? Everyone got the same seats. And people are viewing it, this SNP experiment, folk are coming home. Labour got a bit complacent, Labour got a bit arrogant and thought, we just have to keep hammering the SNP and we'll be fine for Holyrood as well. And as we got closer and closer to the election, people were starting to see the choices between Alex Salmond and the choice between Ian Gray. Ian Gray had that very unfortunate misstep in a sandwich shop with a man called Sean Clerkin, which was quite a famous moment where he kind of seemed to be running away from him. That was the perception anyway. But actually, the record team vision that I've talked about, we were just extolling the virtues of the record, a good team, and we had a vision for Scotland, and that's kind of won the day. But my point is that Labour are not out of this by any stretch, and nobody should view them as out of it, because things could change and change very quickly.
It's astonishing.
Just final word from me on this before we move on. I thought it was interesting at the weekend how the UK media seemed to me to be more interested again in the SNP, and I suspect it's because of John's strategy, and to a degree because the polling at the moment looks like it's not, it looks like it's closer than it perhaps was a few months ago. But I think that raises a lot of the same, of the same questions that we've heard before, and I heard them coming up again at sort of 2014 flashbacks here about deficit, currency, those things coming up again. The answers were not good. No. Not polished, clearly not really properly sort of thought the implications of that through yet. Really, really some very tricky interviews for some cabinet ministers, which we'll all have heard over the last few days, which need a lot of work, I have to say, guys.
Yeah, and I actually think they were caught a wee bit on the hop on that. I think you make a really good point, Andy. And actually, you need to have a formulation that says, well, clearly we will be taking forward a white paper, assuming they do, or something that says that will be laid out in. Don't get yourself committed to stuff just now. Talk about the democratic deficit, because that's your strong point at this point in time. You have to win an election first to even make this part of the conversation. So, yeah, I felt that too. That's a really interesting observation, because I thought, so you've come here talking about independence, but you've not come back with any kind of policy proposals. Don't engage in the premise at this point in time. So, I will be taking forward a white paper should we win the majority.
Yeah,
our threshold will be met.
If I could add a sort of interviewer take on that, because we had Stephen Flynn on Times Radio ahead of the conference, and I was asking him about the deficit, because it's the IFS, and this is the thing. It's when proper, thorough analysis says an independent Scotland would start life with a bigger budget deficit than the UK. Action would be required to address that, some combination of tax rises and spending cuts. And so the only question then is, what taxes are you going to raise, and where are you going to cut spending? And until there's an answer to that, or Geoff, if there's a way to kind of nudge it a bit further down the track, which there wasn't over the last few days, that's a real problem. And that's the only question you then have to ask. That's the thing.
Which is why the SNP want to focus this election campaign, as I said, on trying to stand up for Scotland. It's evidencing that, trying to get your government more competent. Listen, we've done it before. This is the secret sauce has been established. It is. That's how you do it, and then you get to the job of that. But you raise a good point. I mean, one of the reasons that I have always been quite attracted to the idea of independence, and obviously by virtue of that fiscal autonomy, is I want to see Scotland responsible for its own finances. And we've got some decisions in this country that we've made as a devolved government over things that we have no real say over. Sorry to say it, we talk about oil and gas. No First Minister of an independent Scotland would have a presumption against your most economically vibrant, beneficial industry. This is the sort of conversations you need to have when you're in charge of everything and not just some things.
Just as a follow-up then to the kind of SNP conference, Geoff, I want to ask you about this. There's been criticism of the party for the memorial for Alex Salmond over the course of the weekend. So it is part of the conference that proceedings are paused to remember party members who have died in the previous year. And so the memorial this weekend began with a video tribute to Sir George Reid, the former presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament. It ended with an emotional tribute as well to Christina McKelvey, MSP, who died earlier this year. There was a section for Alex Salmond, despite the fact he left the party in 2018, of course. And it started with a clip of Alex Salmond saying, "I heard a rumour, I think we won the election." There was a bit of applause in the room. One of the sort of things about this is the day of the kind of commemorations, I suppose, was also the first anniversary of Alex Salmond's death. And yes, there has been criticism of it from, among others, his niece, Christina Hendry, who posted online, "Disappointed but not surprised. This falls far short of what was deserved." I just wondered what your take was on how the SNP kind of treated Alex Salmond in that in memorial section.
Yeah, and I'll come to that, and maybe a bit of light-hearted stuff before we get to the serious point, is that that was when you read that out about the I heard a rumour we've won an election. Just before that, we're walking up the Royal Mile, right? And I'd just come off a helicopter with him. I'd been with him entirely next to him the whole time. Classic. He says, "Have you written me a speech?" When was I meant to be writing a bloody speech?
Like, so when was this? What election
2007.
Was this?
2007. And so we, and I think it was at is it the Tron, Andy? Up Royal Mile. Yeah, it was at the Tron where we all convened. I walked with him up the road, and then the side door, and he turns around and goes, "Have you written me a speech?" And I says, "I've literally been with you since 6 o'clock this morning." Like, at what point was I meant to be doing that? Anyway, just thought it was pretty funny. Anyway, look, there's been difficulties, we all know that, but I think you can pay respect as a party to the man that did so much for your party, even if you don't particularly care for him. And if you're going to do a tribute, then, and you've decided that, make it a little bit more extensive than 15 seconds. He led the party for 20 years, 2 10-year stints. He oversaw the breakthrough election in 2007. the majority election 2011, which paved the way for the independence referendum, I'd say that's a bit of a decent stint and contribution to your party's fortunes over the years. I just think if you're going to do it, at least make it a bit more extensive than 15 seconds. I mean, what does the leader get that wins independence? Is that 20 seconds? Come on. I think we could do it a wee bit better than that, in all honesty.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, let's turn to some of your questions that you've been sending in over the last little while then. And actually one that kind of follows our conversation. This one says, a question for the best political podcast in Scotland. Thank you for that. I think the tectonic...
To the same which one it is.
No, they might have sent it to the wrong number. Ponsonby and Massey are like, hang on, that's for us. I'm joking, that's a joke. Right, this one says, I think the tectonic plates are shifting in politics, and going forward, the SNP may be in an awkward position. This is Geoff's favourite genre of question, by the way. Old-fashioned left and right is disappearing, and with huge demographic changes underway, the new division will be between socialist globalists and those on the right who still value and want nation-states. It's an interesting dilemma for the SNP, who pride themselves on being different, even from our nearest neighbours, England. If the whole of Europe becomes one multicultural melting pot, what then is the point of the SNP? Shouldn't they actually, Andy, be more aligned with centre-right ethno-nationalists?
There is, I think that identification of what's happening globally is correct. I think that he's right that left-right for the moment is gone in its traditional sense, right? But then you can't then apply left-right to the new world. So there is this new world of, I would call it kind of technocrats, versus nationalists, and if you want to play that out in real terms, it's Starmer versus Farage, right? It's Starmer is a global social democratic technocrat who believes in global institutions, and Farage is a protectionist nationalist. That's where, but you then can't really apply left right to that, because the sort of the capitalists there really sit with the global technocrats and not with the right. So that it is correct. I think the interesting position, I've written about this before, which I know Geoff's read a lot of, John Swinney finds himself, and I think, in a very interesting position in that, though, because John Swinney's a bit of both. And I think that's actually part of the reason why the SNP are still basically doing pretty well. John Swinney is basically a global technocrat, a sort of soft left capitalist who believes in global institutions, but he's also a nationalist at the same time. It's pretty rare globally, I think, that you have somebody who's able to combine both of those things at the same time. And I think he finds himself in a pretty handy position in that respect, to be honest.
Very interesting. Good question. Thank you very much for sending that in. You can email hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us as well. If you've got a question that you'd like answered, then feel free. Lots more of these to do. 0333 404 6507 is the number. Right, let's go on to another one. This is from Matt in Stirlingshire. Hi, Matt. Thanks for getting in touch. Matt says, listening to Shabana Mahmood's conversation with Michael Gove on the Spectator's Coffee House Shots podcast, I was struck by her attempt to define British patriotism through the lens of England. Her words, we need to have the courage to be proud of our tribe so that we can be good neighbours with and welcome other tribes. He says, though, it was strange enough hearing a Labour politician harp on like that about Britishness. However, there was not a single reference to Scotland or the other two nations in any of what she had to say on Britishness, just recurring pointers to the English nation. How wise do you think that actually is, given that much of the weather around the Holyrood election will turn on Reform UK's ability to mobilise Scottish patriotism for British unionism? I think this is an interesting one. And by the way, the other two nations, you can listen to Stormont Sources and Zenith Sources to be taken inside politics in Northern Ireland and Wales. Geoff, I'm coming to you on this. Patriotism clearly is at the heart of an SNP election offer. It has to be. It's the Scottish National Party. How does Reform UK sort of attack that? And is there a weird clash between kind of the feeling of British and the feeling of Scottish?
I don't think that was the most interesting part of the question, if I may say. I thought that the observation made by the listener there about the interview that took place, because this is a real trap Labour have got to watch for themselves. So if there's ever any evidence that Reform are making all the running in British politics, particularly in England. That question is it, because the Labour are saying no, but we're trying. We can be patriotic. We are patriotic, and then deciding how they interpret that. But the problem with that is if you're using that in a British lens, as she did there. You can imagine being Anna Sarwar just now going, oh, for goodness sake, need this like a hole in the head. And that's a real problem. They've got to try and square that circle. Now, to the Scottish experience, one thing that's really interesting is I think we haven't scratched the surface enough on this yet. Reform are speaking to the urban and the rural just now. Not all parts, obviously. They're not anywhere near the SNP in the polls just yet. But they are eeksy-peeksy for second. And what was really interesting about the SNP conference, I wasn't there, but I was in the city and with delegates and all the rest of it, is them talking about their experiences, whether they come from a rural constituency, Reform are on the rise here, or whether they're from an urban one, when speaking to some Glasgow delegates. And I think that's a real threat for all other parties, when you can speak to those different constituencies and seemingly be gaining some traction. That's the problem. So I actually think the SNP are the best placed party, I'm sure Labour won't like me saying this, to tackle that. Because they have established, and you rightly said, they're a national party of Scotland. They should be speaking to all ears and peers. Something I would argue that they haven't done very well in recent years prior to John and Kate coming on board, if I may say. But seemingly, and I take what Andy said earlier, John's making a good fist of trying to rectify that.
Yeah.
I think one thing, just to add to that briefly, and we touched on this a little bit in a previous podcast where we talked a bit more about independence, but the most difficult thing that's happened to the SNP since the last referendum is that their delivery in office has worsened. I mean, I did a bit of a taxi driver test at various points over the weekend in Aberdeen there. I had at various points in Aberdeen 4 taxis. 3 of the 4 were voting Reform. This is not, this is real. And a lot of that are clearly people who would consider themselves to be Scottish patriots. And I don't think are particularly unionist people, I have to say, from the conversations that I had with them. But their real problem has actually been delivery. I mean, one of them said to me, everybody else has had their turn. I thought that was a really telling phrase. Everybody else has had their turn. And that becomes difficult for the SNP. We've said this so many times. I don't want to be boring on it, but actually, the biggest job that John Swinney has got to do is oversee a government that runs things better than the one that he took over in key areas, because that is a massive problem at the moment. You can't really point at stuff in England and say, we're doing much better at that in Scotland than they are in England, because it's not really true. I mean, we've got to do a lot better here, and that's the biggest factor at the moment, guys, in pushing people towards independence, I think.
And there was a flagship commitment made at conference, wasn't there, at the SNP conference? The creation of 15 walk-in GP centres across Scotland to operate from midday till 8 p.m, 7 days a week, no requirement for booking. And the idea is that the 8 a.m. the notorious 8 a.m. rush for appointments will be kind of alleviated. Now, there are criticisms of that GP headcount has kind of fallen since 2013. Demand is up because we've got an ageing population. And so there is something to be considered by way of recruitment. But in terms of delivery, that was another announcement from SNP conference.
I have to say, I wasn't sure about that as the trail of the top line from that speech, actually.
Right.
I think that falls right into the category that taxi driver was talking about, of everybody else has had their turn. I mean, how many NHS-related pledges have we had?
Yeah. From various governments
north and south of the border, and from various opposition parties. Does anybody look at that and say, oh, right, that's sorted now then? I don't know, I have to say. I'm unconvinced about that.
Andy, what it did to me, though, it did tell me that the SNP are very aware and conscious that if Anna Sarwar was making inroads anywhere, it's this constant use of the NHS at First Minister's questions. That's what it spoke to me. If this whole thing is about proving your competence and trying to say that you're listening on the issues that matter, one of the reasons that this is such a big issue, obviously NHS always is, but Anas Sarwar, I would give him credit actually, has done pretty well in supported by Jackie Baillie on the issue of the NHS. And I think that cuts a little bit, and I think they're trying to address that. On the issue itself, don't necessarily disagree with you. I think there's lots of things in the NHS that need solved. On the face of it, if it can be delivered, a good policy announcement, but my goodness, let's see it through. How many policy announcements have we had of late that don't actually get delivered? So they need to deliver it, and deliver it as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I think this message from Sarah is really interesting. So, hi team, I really enjoy listening to your podcast and wanted to share a concern as a voter and hear your thoughts. Lately, I've noticed that many Scottish political parties and politicians are spending a lot of time talking about the situation in Gaza. While I absolutely recognise the humanitarian importance of the issue, I'm increasingly worried that it's overshadowing the very real and immediate challenges people here in Scotland are facing day to day. Things like the cost of living, the state of our roads, pressures on schools and doctors, and, Sarah says, the impact of Westminster policies on our farmers and communities. With an election coming up in May, I'll be looking to vote for a party that focuses on these local issues, the things our Parliament can directly influence and improve. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether the parties are over-indexing, she says, on international issues, or if it's still too early in the election cycle for this to meaningfully affect voter choices. Thanks for all the work you do in keeping political discussion open, respectful and engaging. Well, thank you, Sarah, for being a very important part of it. We appreciate your message. Andy, she says, local issues, the things our Parliament can directly influence and improve. Now, I will probably put my hands up here and say that when I ask questions of politicians, often you are driven by the agenda of the day, and a lot recently has been driven by peace in Gaza, work towards peace in Gaza. Even last week on this podcast, we were speaking to the co-leaders of the Scottish Greens because Ross Greer had been out on a march that he's spoken of and he answered on the podcast last week, but, you know, a broadly pro-Palestine march. And so you feel the need to speak about these things and to ask questions of these politicians who are engaging in that way. So I'll just sort of say that often you're driven by the agenda of the day when you're asking questions, and I kind of feel that as a bit of a burden in this context. But Andy, what's your take?
Well, the short answer to the question is yes, which is that they are, to use the questioner's language, over-indexing. Look, I completely understand why politicians would want to talk about Gaza a lot. I understand why... and it's also perfectly proper for it to be in the news all the time because it's an enormous global issue, which is taking up a lot of the time of the Prime Minister and others, and rightly so, because it's something which obviously there's a massive interest in solving. But you have to also believe that two things can be true at once. That can be a big issue which will exercise people and which people will feel very strongly about. But just look at issues trackers in the polling. I mean, it's very clear. If you ask people what the biggest issues are that are affecting them, Gaza's not there. It's not even close. So clearly, if you ask somebody an isolated question, do you care about what's happening in Gaza? Yes or no? Right? You're going to get massive spike for yes. It's going to be, almost 100% of people who care about what's happening in Gaza. But if you say, what are your top 5 issues? It is not there for the vast majority of people. It's health, it's the economy. In some parts of the country, it might be immigration, crime, and so on. It'll be housing, it'll be transport. This is just the reality of politics in this country. We don't vote based on international affairs, whether it's Gaza or anywhere else. That's not how we vote in this country. We never have, and we're not going to this time either.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you, Geoff. Get well soon, Geoff, I suppose. I don't know. And well done, Cash. A hero to the NHS. Anyway, whatever. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Andy. And thank you for your questions. You can get in touch anytime with your thoughts, with your analysis, with the points that you want to agree on or disagree on that you hear on the podcast. You can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507 or email us hello@holyroodsources.com. Thanks so much for listening. If you would like to watch this podcast, you can find us on YouTube. You can subscribe there for free as well to see full episodes in your feed. Thanks for being with us, and we will talk to you next week.